technically horticulture is in my title, but I tend to lean a little bit more towards the environmental when I can. Just a very brief background on me. I am from Rock Island originally, so Quad Cities have a very near and dear place in my heart. I went to school at Loyola University Chicago, where I studied environmental science and focused in restoration and conservation ecology. So restoration is definitely kind of at my core of what I really care about, and thus that intertwines with invasive species almost every single time. My background actually with the city started with natural resources in 2017 as an intern. And then that has brought me to today, where I've been with the Parks Department now for the past 2 years. And as I mentioned, my background's in restoration. I do a lot of education. If you're interested, I will be having some work days coming up where we're going to be doing some restoration work. It's really just going to be clearing out some woodies and stuff like that. And we'll get into some of the highlights, if you will, of what those invasives look like. But the main thing I want to talk about today is just a better understanding of what the big deal of invasive species even is. A lot of people kind of have a misunderstanding that they're just annoying, which true, but they have quite a bit of impact on our environment. So first things first, we're going to do a quick little video, which you hold on.
Bear with me.
I promise it's quick, but technology as it is.
Oh my gosh. I love when things work. And I will turn it up. All right, if this is too loud, please let me know. Do not want to blow your eardrums out.
Invasive species. You've probably heard the term, but what exactly does it mean? And how is it different than terms like non-native species or pests? Great question. Come along with us as we explore these different terms. First, a little sneak peek into invasive species. Invasive species include plants and animals, both in water and on land. They are found in many places, including national parks. They threaten the Park Service mission to preserve unimpaired America's natural and cultural resources. So what makes a plant or animal invasive? Does it have to do with a certain amount of damage, or is it just a species that left its own habitat? Let's talk about some other definitions, like native and non-native, before we dive into the big question. Native species. These are all organisms that have occurred, now occur, or may occur without human intervention. One example is the white-footed mouse. It's native throughout the eastern United States. When found in nature, the mouse is an integral part of the ecosystem. Non-native species. These are species that do not occur naturally in an area, but are introduced as a result of a deliberate or accidental human activity. Most importantly, they exist where they have not naturally occurred and may even be considered beneficial under certain circumstances. One example you may recognize is the bell pepper. It's not native to the United States, but it currently presents no threat to native plants. Now it's finally time to explore invasive species. Invasive species are non-native species that cause harm to the environment, cultural resources, infrastructure, economy, human safety and health, as well as plant and animal health. One example is kudzu. Kudzu was introduced to the United States in 1876 at an exposition in Philadelphia. It can grow up to a foot a day, allowing it to easily outcompete and kill other plants. It even grows over power lines and poles, causing damage that results in the loss of power to communities. Now you may be thinking, where do pests fit into all of this? Great question. Let's bring back our old friend, the white-footed mouse. As we said earlier, the white-footed mouse is a native species throughout the eastern United States when found in nature. But when found in and around structures, the mouse poses significant threats to resources and human health, and it's considered to be a pest. A pest is any organism that interferes with management objectives or threatens human health or safety. A pest can be native or non-native. All invasive species are pests, but not all pests are invasive species. Confused? For instance, a feral swine is non-native because it did not originate in the US, a pest because it causes damage to a variety of resources. and it's invasive both because it's non-native and causes harm. On the other hand, the white-footed mouse is native because it comes from the US and may be a pest if it causes damage or health issues, but it's not invasive because it is native. Phew, we threw you a lot of information in a short amount of time. Find out.
Don't wanna.
So that was just a really easy way to kind of give you a brief overview. The terminology around invasive species and even just terms like pest and weed can get a little confusing sometimes because a lot of people have kind of their own interpretation it comes in a lot of times. And obviously we're speaking from a North American, specifically Midwestern view. So some of the species that we have in our area can become invasive elsewhere. So it is really all perspective. And if you're not familiar, like even the term weed, for instance, is simply just a plant where you don't want it to be. So really anything can be a weed. You can have the most beautiful rose bush and it's in your gutter. That's a weed. Something like that. So here is kind of a little bit more of a breakdown of the differences between non-native and native, and then how some of those can kind of intertwine. So invasive specifically has to do with a plant that did not originally evolve in this area and therefore was brought by some force, whether that was accidental. There's a lot of things like hitchhikers, a lot of insects will actually become invasive because they're either brought with different like things like cattle or on food crop. There's also diseases that become invasive. And then there's, situations where unfortunately, a lot of the things that we're dealing with today were brought over intentionally. A lot of settlers would bring certain plants in particular. This is true for animals and plants, but again, speaking from the parks perspective, I have a little bit more knowledge on the plant side, so we'll focus on that just a bit. But in regards of our, certain things like burdock or really just honestly like garlic mustard, all of these very common woodland and prairie species that we find to be very invasive, most likely had some sort of benefit that they were brought here for that reason, whether it was as a food crop. So even like garlic mustard, there's food in that. Or for instance, with some of our other ones, it would be actually for medicinal purposes. And then a lot of plants also are just pretty. A lot of our invasives have really beautiful flowers. And so they were either brought as something to, kind of remind people of their homelands. It's people who are coming here, not necessarily knowing what's going to be at this new continent. And they wanted to make sure that they had their creature comforts, if you will. And they didn't necessarily know how much that particular plant might outcompete another one, and so on and so forth. So there's, a lot of different ways that plants and animals and different species can become invasive. Unfortunately, almost all of those are going to be tied to human activity. So whether we mean to or not, we are definitely a pretty big vector of how these species get into our places. Even when we're talking about aquatic species, a lot of those are, again, either hitchhikers, just, we all probably have heard of zebra mussels. They're a really, really big issue in our area, being here on the Mississippi waterway. And those can just stick onto your boat and then go to the next one and fall off and stick onto another boat and so on and so forth. And even way back when we were like doing mostly water travel, that was when a lot of invasive species came through on ballast water. And so that still happens, but there's definitely a lot more awareness and understanding of basically preventing things like that and having a little bit more checks and balances when it comes to that. But I also want to point out that there are native species that can be aggressive or advantageous. So basically, that just means that they can also be really good at growing. So just because something is very good at growing and can outcompete other things does not inherently make it invasive. But that's where, again, terms can get a little confusing, but if you can think of the idea of a generalist versus a specialist, Things like our dandelions, for instance, are generalists. They can really make do in a lot of different places. Those are a little bit on the edge. Some people consider them invasive. They're kind of naturalized at this point, so they don't quite rank as high in the order of what we worry about when it comes to invasives. But that's a generalist species that can find a lot of different locations and thrive there. Whereas then we have our specialized species that need very specific environments, very specific food, water, sun, all those different needs. And when a generalist comes into that same space that maybe that specialized species needs, and they're like, oh, I can handle this, they might actually start to push out that specialized species. So it really comes down to how well things survive, but also what is actually already in that location to begin with. So here in the Quad Cities, these are specifically in Scott and Rock Island County. We do have quite a few threatened and endangered species. Again, we're on the Mississippi, so we're lucky enough to be in a space where we have some really cool aquatic threatened species. So over there, that's the Higgins eye or pearly mussel. It's just really pretty. And then down here we have the spectroplaces. A lot of these also are endangered from human activities, just as in like, you know, harvesting them from the rivers themselves, utilizing them for our own benefits, or sometimes eradication just because we consider them pests, even though, you know, they're meant to be here and we're kind of stepping on their land. But this is just something to keep in mind, that even in this area where, you know, you might not necessarily think of these endangered species, because a lot of times we think of like the Amazon and some of these places that deserve a lot of attention, but definitely kind of have a little bit more of that attention. We might not think that it is literally in our own backyard that these species are still being affected, and therefore we can make an impact on them. Even just monarch butterflies, they're currently a candidate. Their listing status is going to be finalized supposedly in this fall, so keep an eye out. But that's something that, you know, even just having our butterfly milkweed in general, those types of things in your yard, that can actually have a really big impact on that. So it's just these little things to think about. Yeah.
What does candidate mean?
It means that it's not currently listed, but it's being considered. Yeah, it was brought up to the council in 2020 because population started to decline. So not 100% listed, but definitely one that is in need of attention. So as we're talking about our generalists and our specialists, you can see here, this is, I know, a lot of colors, a lot of numbers. It looks a little bit skewed just because if you look over on the side there, you can see that these different species categories, they're wildly different. So the ones that look like, oh, well, birds are doing okay, you know, that's not too bad. It's because there's almost 11,000 birds. So this amount is actually a lot bigger than it seems. So it's also something just to keep perspective in that regard, that as much as we might have these really wide, diverse genre of species, there's a reason for that, basically. It's really important to have that high biodiversity so that they can fill in those special niches. And then therefore, you know, certain birds might need a very specific insect that only grows on a specific plant. And if that plant is outcompeted by Japanese knotweed, for instance, then we might lose that particular caterpillar that feeds that bird, and it can really cause just this huge ripple effect. And we're only really starting to understand how catastrophic that can become, because again, a lot of these invasive species were only brought over in the last like 200 to 300 years, and even many have just been in the last century. So it's hard to really gauge how much of an impact this will have, just given that these species do very slowly die out. So unfortunately, it's one of those things that we won't know until we know. But once you kind of are able to start understanding how much each and every one of these categories of animals and plants are affected, you can also understand that your little bit of impact and working towards conservation and protecting them and restoring certain habitats can also have a really huge impact. So it's actually estimated that of all of these species that are threatened and endangered, 42% of them are directly endangered because of invasive species encroachment. So again, there's issues with climate change and just changing environment from human encroachment. But with all of those things, those often are deeply connected to invasive species as well. It kind of goes hand in hand with a changing climate. Changing species come in there, and the ones that are, again, a generalist and a bit more adaptable, they will be able to handle that a lot better than some of our more specialized and delicate, if you will, native species. So this map here shows the biodiversity intactness index. And this was taken in 2020, so I don't think it's changed too much since then. The main thing to highlight is the very light areas. That is where it is a very low diversity. So basically what that means is that it's not a very resilient ecosystem. So as I say, with the idea of we're not seeing the long timeline of how these things are changing, as biodiversity continues to go down, it'll basically keep doing that. It's kind of a self-fulfilling cycle. So the places that are darker, they do have a higher biodiversity. Also, you can kind of assume some of those places are a little bit more specialized, and even if they're highly diverse in their particular space, they might just not be as welcoming to other general species, like we see obviously our boreal or areas. But to highlight where we are in the Midwest there, pretty light, unfortunately. And then next one that would be pretty obvious is down here in the Amazon. So these places, again, if you're looking proportionately, yes, we might not have as many species as in the Amazon, but it's just that understanding that we also have way less than there probably was originally who, you know, evolved for this area. And so by having that lower biodiversity, it means that, you know, a flood could cause even more of those very delicate species to just disappear. We wouldn't be able to, you know, bounce back from something like that. So that's just something to keep in mind. Basically, it kind of shows how much closer we are to a full ecosystem collapse, which can be a little scary to think about. So again, it's not necessarily something that will likely happen in our lifetime, but that doesn't mean that it's not really important to think about and to try and make any impact that you can on it. So specifically, again, in our area, we're in a really special place. Again, I am partial to the QC from, you know, being from here, but also having perspective of traveling around our country. We're in this really unique space where north meets south and east meets west, and it really converges right around our area. So therefore, we have a lot of really unique spaces, but at the same time, we're along the Mississippi. That's a major trade route. We're in the midst of a pretty major flyway. There's a lot of movement that's happening in our area. And so therefore, we're also in a place where higher impacts can be had, positive and negative. And unfortunately, it's kind of leaning in the negative right now. Again, with the waterways in particular, we're not only dealing with things like mussels, but also aquatic plants that can really overtake just the waterways themselves. It can affect our recreation in those waterways. It can affect the fishing industries that happen around here. But this is just a really good understanding of how truly unique a lot of the different places within our country is, and how, you know, if you think about those specialized species, there's all these different biota that basically, if they disappear from that particular spot, they're probably not going to be able to survive in another spot. Whereas our generalized species, they'll sneak in there and they'll just fill in the blanks, and that will actually make these colors kind of homogenize a little bit more. So there won't be that really striking difference in all these different ecoregions. So why? We talked a little bit about environmental. So like I said, it not only changes just the general makeup of what is in that environment, but it can actually also slow down ecosystem services. So ecosystem services mean not only what the ecosystem does for itself, but from a human perspective, what we benefit from. So in regards of like our natural resources, obviously, if we don't have some of our, in particular this area, we have a lot of tall grass prairies. We've lost a lot of those tall grass prairies. And if we continue to lose those, that creates higher flood impact. It, you know, basically changes the soil structure that we're dealing with. And that can lead to higher impacts on, you know, diseases that are spread throughout these different species. Blights and things like that are much easier to transfer when there isn't that really high biodiversity to kind of slow that down. So as we, again, homogenize not only the environment itself, but the population within that, it can really just create this huge spiral that basically can obliterate a whole environment. And actually a lot of stuff comes down to like not just the competition, but if you're familiar, for instance, with our native cattails, we're currently dealing with an invasive cattail that is hybridizing with our native cattail. Therefore, we're losing that genetic material and basically losing the species without it just completely disappearing. It's because it's, again, homogenizing. And so we don't have that specialized spaces that certain waterfowl, for instance, prefer to have our native typha versus the invasive typha. And as they hybridize, they're not going to really have a choice anymore. Next would be the hydrology. So like I kind of talked about in regards of our soil structure changing, it's just not able to hold as much because our native roots are not going as deep with, or sorry, the native roots would go deep, but the invasives are not going as deep as the native roots. Therefore, just like not holding as much of the water itself, but also carbon sequestration, again, leading back into more climate change impact. And with that, it also can lead to damaged crops and things that would then impact our economy a lot more. So a lot of times when we talk about invasive species, especially in regards of plants, it is a little bit easy to just focus on how it's affecting simply the environment and simply the species therein. But we are species in our environment, and it does affect basically everything that we do to live. We rely on our environment for all of these different things. I mentioned our ecosystem services of, you know, like flood control in our area. And obviously being from the Midwest, we have a lot of farmland, which can also bode some issues with invasive species, as we have our monocultures that does allow for, again, that homogenized space. It creates a little bit more of this flow for different diseases and species to come through a little bit easier because they're just able to jump from one to the other instead of maybe having to move through a little bit more of a diverse space. And so, as we mentioned, like crops, yes, but it also affects our timberlands. On the riverways, it can clog water pipes with, you know, those zebra mussels. They just get really, really dense. It can affect fisheries and water quality of how things are even able to survive. And actually just within the United States alone, it is, and this is a figure from 2001, so I can't even really imagine how much it's changed since then, but it was estimated to be about $138 billion every single year, either dealing with prevention, control, or basically repair because of invasive species. So even if we, maybe we're like, oh, what's the big deal about plants changing? Like, what if we lose a couple birds? So what? It's really just that those little things that we might be able to see lead into these much larger things that we might take for granted or we kind of expect is coming from something else. But it's again that ripple effect and understanding how much of an intricate balance a lot of our ecosystems are. So the next issue would be, again, that ecosystem services. So that also includes the soil fertility, that includes pollination. We talk a lot about pollinators, and at Vanderveer, for instance, over at the conservatory, we do actually have honeybees, which everyone loves bees. A lot of people like honey, but I have to, even talk with my coworkers about the idea that honeybees are great. However, they are not necessarily the ones that we should really be worrying about, because in the grand scheme of things, if you kind of step back and think about our terminology, honeybees can be considered invasive. They don't cause necessarily damage in the way that we think of certain, insects that we know, like the emerald ash borer, that very, very clearly cause damage. But honeybees can outcompete our native pollinators. And one of the things that I like to kind of highlight, does anyone have any idea how many flowers out of 100, if a honeybee visits them, how many of those are actually pollinated to completion? So like it creates a fruit or a seed. Any guesses? It's actually only 5%. So they're really busy. They go to a lot of flowers, but they're not necessarily doing the best job. But with our native pollinators, so we saw earlier, we have the rusty patch bee that was actually found at Nahant and at Sunderbrook. And it is around this area, which is very exciting to know. But we have our rusty patch, we have things like carpenter bees and mason bees and leafcutter bees. Anyone want to guess what the native bees, if they visit 100 flowers? Any ideas?
95.
It's actually 95 exactly. Yes. So it's one of those things that it might not seem like that big of a deal because it's like a bee is a bee, right? But honeybees are those generalized species. They can visit a ton of flowers, and they might get that little bit of pollen stuck on their little pollen sac, but it might not make it to the next flower to actually do the ecosystem services that are required for those plants to survive. Whereas our little fuzzy native bees have hair all over their body and they get pollen everywhere. And so they go to the next flower and there's probably going to be at least some that gets there. So again, it's that idea, yes, they're specialized, but they also evolved in this area with the species that are in this area. So they're meant to be here. They're meant to do the job that they were trained to do, if you will. And so as much as someone might come in and still do the job, it's not necessarily actually creating the impact that the species that were created for that to do. And so if we keep losing that, then we'll really see the impact of that and how much isn't really happening from those generalized species coming in. And then also there is damage to infrastructure that can happen. We mentioned, the zebra mussels, that's definitely something, but as you saw in that video, kudzu is a great example of that. We're really lucky that kudzu has not made it to our area quite yet. I do know it is in southern Illinois, so we're probably not too far away from it starting to sneak up here. Oh, really? Ooh, well, that's even closer. So, yeah, I mean, it's it's one of those species that's a little bit more, you can definitely see its impact. But there's a lot of silent killers, if you will, that are doing very similar things. But when these plants are really, really great growers, we're not necessarily prepared for that. And so already with climate change and just general weather changes, we're finding that our infrastructure isn't quite prepared for a lot of it. And so when you toss in all of these different species that can also affect those things and continue to change weather patterns and things like that, we're going to continue to see even more damage. And basically, it's just going to also affect, you know, again, the cycle of climate change and losing even our more dainty and maybe cuter species that we do really enjoy. And then the next one would be similar in that way. It affects our culture and our recreation, specifically in our area. Again, I'll bring up the river. We have a lot of boating that happens. And so, you know, if you go to a lake and it has a bunch of Eurasian milfoil in it, you might not be able to boat as easily as you could. And if there is a lot of, you know, crayfish, for instance, that are eating up all of the fish eggs, you're not going to be able to fish anymore. And there's even changes in the habitat underneath the water that affects those things. Recreation coming from a park's perspective, you know, it's not only harder for our folks to go out and maintain trails and things like that, because it's just more stuff to deal with. But if there's not people who are able to keep up with those things, then you might just lose the ability to enter some of those spaces. Or even if it's potentially, you know, open woodland that you used to visit that maybe doesn't have a maintenance crew, it might not be able to be traversed anymore because now there's buckthorn and honeysuckle that have grown up in that understory, pretty much making it inaccessible. So there's that side of it. And then not quite as much in our area specifically, but throughout, you know, the world, there are a lot of different cultures that rely on very specific plants in particular, but species in general for either medicinal purposes, religious purposes, and just general cultural connection to their space. And so as they lose those, that is obviously going to change how their culture lives, potentially how people survive. And also it just really can be a detriment to the beauty of the natural lands that we have. Because having, you know, all these different small little flowers, even if they're maybe not the most showy, to be able to have that wide, diverse view is always going to be much more exciting than having one big monoculture of honeysuckle, for instance. Even if it has a pretty little flower, it's just not going to have the same impact as having that diversity. All right. One thing also kind of tied to human health, but a little bit more of for like the personal gardener. You know, we're even dealing with things like the Asian jumping worm, which can affect basically just how your garden does. You might not have as much fruits from your trees. You might not have as healthy of veggies and things like that. And again, that creates this kind of domino effect of if you have one particular type of invasive insect or plant that's starting to affect your personal space, it might drive away some of those other really good beneficial pollinators and birds and things like that, because they're not finding kind of their buddies that they need in those spaces because they've been replaced. And so specifically speaking on human health, again, I mentioned that some places have things like traditional medicine, but the reality is the vast majority of our medicine does come from some form of biological material that we've either been using from the source or have, basically utilize some form of it to synthesize into some sort of medicine. It can again completely affect climate change. And so if that's again like a trickle down effect that directly can impact how people's lives are lived, whether that just be the heat, things continue to get warmer and uncomfy, but also it changes, what type of spaces we have for respite. Again, if we lose potentially like our open woodlands, you can't really necessarily go through there and enjoy like a cool walk in the woods. It might start getting a little bit more barren and outcompeted. And then of course that also has an effect on our food security. Luckily, a lot of us are in a place where we can depend on a grocery store, but not everyone is in that same position. And also depending on how this continues, again, we're speaking more so from our perspective in North America, but that doesn't mean that the places that we get our foods from are not also being affected by their own invasive species. And so the more we have to put out, either herbicides to control those things, that can affect our food systems. It can affect just the space that's even available to grow foods and to produce medicines. And in general, the more you see, these really kind of, I'll be real, ugly spaces with really messy, gross, buckthorn, and it just isn't looking quite as nice as it naturally would with that traditional competition. You're just not necessarily getting that positive feeling from nature as well, which I think a lot of us really undervalue how much of an impact our surroundings can affect not only just our general mood, but our overall health as well. So I know a lot of this is still fairly fraught and there's a lot of different opinions on, again, even what makes something invasive. Even within the restoration world, it's hard to kind of triage, if you will, and figure out what should really be focused on and how much we can have more of a broad view of what we can treat and how much we need to like really focus in and kind of maybe pick the things that maybe are not as well established and get those knocked back so that we don't have to continue to have more and more and more, and then slowly but surely, hopefully, continue to knock those back. So I bring this up mainly just because, again, some of these are pretty well established at this point, so it is a little difficult just to say like, get rid of all your invasives, only have natives. That's unfortunately just not going to be the case. But the more that you're able to pay attention, you can find these certain circumstances in which you can either control your own little space and, remove invasive species, or if you're, maybe part of certain clubs, or you now know Partners of Scott County Watershed has some work days, City of Davenport has some work days. There's definitely opportunities in which you can lend a hand and create that impact, because it's an uphill battle. It's going to continue to be that, but it's worth it, because even if we can slow it just a little bit, that's going to give us more time to appreciate the earth as it wants to be appreciated. Again, the plants that we have that have evolved here, they want to be here. We should want them to be here. And it just creates a much more intense feeling of home, at least in my opinion, when you can really get to know your true neighbors, if you will, and not just the plants around you, but the ones who really help out with your particular space, and in turn, you can help them out as well. And that's because biodiversity is beautiful. So again, we're in farmlands, we're in the Midwest. It's not going to be 100% all the time that we can have it as perfect as we want, but you really can make an impact. And I think it's just something to kind of, again, bring your attention to a little bit more. If you can, do some more research on your own. If you have specific questions about particular invasives, I can do my best. But there's a lot of different opportunities, again, for work days, a lot of opportunities to learn more. And there's a lot of really cool work being done in the Quad Cities in particular, supporting native species and creating more native habitats. So I think just the more excitement there is around that, the more that it's going to continue, and that ripple effect that we talked about on the negative side can in fact be a ripple effect on the positive side. Thank you.
There is a plant that's grows like kudzu. And as a matter of fact, there's two different species. One's kind of spiny with, spiky leaves,
Mhm.
and it grows in a mat that kills everything underneath it. And another one I'm seeing out at Craig Island that's growing over, and that's got a greener, it's a softer leaf than the other one, and it's growing up and over the trees and things like kudzu. I don't know what either one of those are.
Yeah, there's, again, unfortunately, there are some that are just native species that, again, when there's a lower biodiversity, those really aggressive native plants are unchecked, and so they kind of become in the same way. So even our things like our native grapevines can really become a big issue when they don't have either plants to compete with or potentially those insects that predate on them, or birds and vice versa, and all that. So there's unfortunately a lot of different species that are doing things like that. But I think we have a brief presentation about one of the invasive species in our area. If Hugh, you'd like to go ahead and talk on that. And then afterwards, I'll answer any other questions as we go, but I'm gonna hand it over to Hugh here.
My name is Hugh Safford. I've been a longtime resident of the Iowa Quad Cities. My friend here is a Japanese nut. Now, how many of you are familiar with Japanese nut? Japanese nut.
Not weed.
Knot. I came across this fellow when I was fishing up in the Driftless area. Up in the northeast part of the state, where they have lots of trout, lots of streams. And I was just shocked at what this weed has done to that weed. It grows rapidly. This was this high, beginning of the spring. And it'll get to 12 feet. Like again, well, maybe not like. And it propagates by rhizome. There's not over rhizome. It goes, the little thing goes out, and then it pops up again. Well, in this case, it pops up really close to this one. And then, so if you are walking into the stream and you come to a stream, and these are there, you take it through. You cannot walk through the it's like bamboo. They get fairly thick and they get hard. And so I came back and did some study on the Japanese nut, and then decided that someone needed to do something about it. Because nobody was saying it, at least in my limited, except in Alameda County, which is part of the north. And the DNR is struggling, keeping this at bay in some of their streams, going to paint and some other rivers. So I decided to take on the task of getting rid of this Nazi, which could be at my age rather foolish. and an impossible task. But there it is. Retired. I might as well do something. Constructive as opposed to sitting and filling the thoughts. So in order to get this, in order to get rid of it, we needed to get it some publicity. And we need to find out where it is and how much it is. Because nobody's going to pay attention to a plant that is in 8 places in the state. So we have to identify every place this occurs. In Illinois, beneficially, the the University of Georgia has created a mapping system that maps invasive species of all kinds throughout the world. And you can go on your phone and you can identify a product or a weed on the phone. It will identify the lat long. It will show it on a map. And we will, and we haven't yet, but we will create our own map for Iowa. And then you report into digitally, because we send it on the upload. And so we have the capability to create the type of media that legislators understand.
Mm-hmm.
So we can say, here are all the places that this plant is, it exists in Iowa. And hopefully, this will result in their awareness that this has to go. Because it hits every bad thing. Because it wipes out whatever's around it. It just takes, it usually is by streams, rivers. This came out of Duck Creek. Does anybody know do you know where Robin Creek is? The professional student. Robin Creek is up on, it crosses Marquette and then drifts south. And so it's called, and there are places in that are just packed with this. And it's starting to move in places where it really propagates well in disturbed soil. So you go over by the high school, the new middle, you go by Mid-City High, then it's starting to go perpendicular out from Robin Creek. So my reason for being here is to kind of twofold. One is that I get a lot of the professionals here who haven't heard my story. I get to tell them the story. And two, to ask you if you come across this, I'd like to. That's
At the Davenport Veterans Memorial Park and the old Davenport Dam. So it's going upland by the Mississippi River, and it's not only in the park, but it's also growing in the wooded areas along the old Davenport.
Can you wait afterwards a little bit and help me with that? There's a lot.
I can also send his contact out to this group today, and then you guys can make a list and send it to him via email, so you can have that as well.
And you can you can call me with the location as you've done, or you can go down. I'll give you the way to get it on your phone. But I really appreciate Taylor, you and you letting me. Yeah.
So how did you get there? I mean, was that pretty?
Well, let's see.
Purpose at one point?
One of the problems with starting this grade one of my memories.
Oh.
Is,
I mean, did
but
it flower or?
it came over as an ornamental from the state. It's all the Japanese. I have trouble with the Japanese. So I'm trying to limit this to happen. I don't want to get blamed. The Japanese have enough problem with their own. I don't need to be adding to their problem. So, it's a.
Actually, the Japanese will let any invasive into the land. You cannot bring a plant into the land. I mean, how is it for
Well, they're certainly not worried about leaving.
Yeah. Well, we're letting them in.
Yeah, so we have, so it's an ornamental in the 1800s.
And this particular plant, you mentioned the rhizomes, but it also grows from basically like any material of the plant itself. If it gets into soil, it can regrow from even a leaf or a chunk of the stem. And so it being on waterways, even if it gets like stomped down and it falls into the water, that's how it really easily can.
And it's hard to kill. I mean, that is, because that's another, it's a hard and expensive, because digging it up doesn't work.
So is it woody or hollow or?
It's
how
pretty
many miles
hollow.
does it get that?
I would say it probably gets at most, the base would be around like a quarter to a $50 at the largest.
How do you use it?
Um,
What's it, like chemical?
yeah, it's unfortunately, it's one of those that does take almost exclusively pesticide to take it out. I lived in Vermont for a couple years, and out there, almost every single stream that is a forest of knotweed. So I really appreciate, you bringing this to our attention, because I mean, Vermont's a beautiful place, but especially when you're down by the riverways, it's kind of depressing. And us being such a water-based area, I think it's really important to try and do something like this that isn't completely taking over. And that's where kind of that idea of like triage comes in, that if we can try and address something like this before it gets insanely out of hand, we can try and knock it back and then the next one.
I was thinking, just, you know, like, this is on, Duck. And it's 2 doors down from where I live. And I came across it walking my dog. And thought, oh my gosh. You know, I'm worried about going up North Iowa, it's right here, that's kind of when they got started. But the disaster too, you can break it off and burn it, if you don't burn everything, those little pieces will go down the street.
Invasives are
Really
really good at living.
Right, it's incredible, that's why we need to do something now. Yeah.
I read that in England, it's been recognized as such a problem, that if you have it on your property, the chances of you being able to sell your property.
Yeah, one of the things that have hindered this plant's attention to this plant is that it is not on Iowa's invasive species. Invasive species list, if you make that list, then the state can require you to deal with it. Well, so part of my effort in getting, or the result of getting a list of where it is that the state bringing the attention to it, is to do so, to promote the idea that it belongs on invasive, invasive species. When I talked to the head entomologist, and she thinks that this is in the top 10 biggest problems that we're gonna have going into. So, she's all behind this. I don't know where the secretary's going. So I've got a long way to go. I've only been doing this for a month or so. It's driving my wife crazy.
Thank you, Hugh, for coming and talking about that. Maybe we'll get a few questions and then we'll probably get wrapped up. So if anything pressing that you'd really like answered, you can hop away, but again, probably just a couple, and then anything else, I'll send out some information. You can send some emails, and I'll probably have this recording up on our YouTube. You can come back and look at, and then anything else, you can shoot me an email. I'll try to get you oriented with the person that can answer that for you.
What about poison hemlock? It seems like I never noticed it until about 4 years ago, primarily along railroads. About this time of year. I mean, it's a beautiful plant, but oh my gosh, it is everywhere. Is that a new occurrence, or is something changing that just really allows it to?
It's definitely been around. I think it's hard to say if something's changed necessarily, just because it is one of those things with invasives in particular. I mean, it can take, you know, just one combative insect or something to die off, or, you know, to maybe be pushed off, and then all of a sudden it's like, I got free reign now.
Is it native or not?
I don't think so. I know it's a noxious weed, so I was like, it's considered noxious, so it's like slightly different than invasive, but that makes sense, yeah, so, no, it's.
Do you have anything else?
Great, couple of things, for those who don't know me, I'm Bob Bryant, was the director of the Trent County Conservation Division. For the 16 years, I was involved from North Trent County, I started the Walk the River thing, and then retired, and I got involved heavily with paying that mark. And so I've been up here in 75. And one thing we found out about Iowa, I'm one of the few people not afraid to say it. And I know people in Illinois who say it. Iowa's #1 in destruction of its natural areas. Illinois is #2. Iowa's trying to keep the Fed to be #1. Now, here's what you brought up about a native species. What is a native species? You have to look at it state by state. And well, that's one thing when you look at there's ways to find it, but sometimes it's kind of hard to find. Now, when it comes to an endangered species, who decides what is endangered species? The big wildlife service and that's the difference. That's only on federal state, but not on state. Iowa, or Illinois. I bet it's something associated with no. State legislature.
You go out to you.
That's right. Maybe I think all the biologists can do from the threatened endangered species group, they can only recommend that threatened endangered species has only been since 1994. When I think when one species has been added, and that the boulder one that was found in Frank County, that was the species that never been found in the state. But we found the ones in Illinois that was found out, the second one side for that. And Illinois found in a record, and that was done by Grant Sessions, just by Wilson Step Up. And it was in a record in Texas, and it was record also split in 1895. So the state legislature has every time they presented a threatened endangered species, over to know every year. This has gone on since 1994.
Thank you, Bob. We appreciate you and your wisdom, bringing in a little bit extra knowledge. So that is everything that we have today. And again, any questions, please let me know. I'll be sending out just a little bit of tidbit after this. Thank you so much, Taylor, for coming in and spreading all this awareness. It's incredibly important as we take care of our watersheds. This is an incredibly important problem. Always come out and do a work day with us. We are always removing invasive species in every creek I see and find. Again, thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you taking time out of your day. It's always great to have new faces. So again, if you want to know more about partners in Scott County Watershed, I have a business card. You can come find me. And again, thank you.
And really quick, I mentioned work days, but I also have a bunch of classes on native plants if you're interested, because again, this is my heart. So please visit me at Davenport Parks and you'll catch some cool stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, I forgot, I brought this book, called Endangered Beauty, if anyone wants to look through, these are all